The airport announcement echoed through the terminal as Grace Johnson felt her husband press something cold and hard into her palm. She looked down. Her passport. Mark's fingers were already pointing toward the exit doors, his voice loud enough for the strangers around them to hear. Go home. People walking past slowed their steps. A woman pulling a suitcase paused mid-stride. Grace blinked, certain she had misheard him over the noise of the terminal. Mark laughed, the kind of laugh he used when he wanted an audience to notice him. He tilted his head toward the three men standing a few feet away, all of them grinning like they'd just watched something entertaining. My friends are here, he said. Don't make this awkward. One of the men, tall, sunburned, wearing a jersey 2 sizes too tight, smirked and said, Guess somebody's traveling solo. The others laughed. Mark laughed harder, encouraged by them, feeding off their attention the way he always did when he had people to perform for. Grace stood still. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him, steady and calm, the way she looked at difficult clients before closing a deal they thought they'd already won. Are you absolutely sure? She asked. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Mark waved his hand at her like she was a fly buzzing near his food. Yes, go. I've got this handled. Grace said nothing else. She turned, walked a few steps away from the group, and opened her phone. Her thumb moved across the screen. Tap, tap, tap. 30 seconds later, phones around Mark began to vibrate. His friends looked down first, confused expressions crossing their faces. Then Mark's own phone buzzed in his pocket. Boarding canceled. VIP passes canceled. Hotel reservation canceled. Private transfer canceled. Mark frowned at his screen, laughed it off as some kind of glitch, and turned to walk toward the security checkpoint with his friends, still grinning, still certain the weekend belonged to him. He handed his ticket to the security officer with the same confidence he handed his business card to strangers at parties. The scanner beeped. Red light. Sir, the officer said, glancing at the screen. This credential no longer exists. Mark's smile disappeared. He didn't know it yet, but the weekend he had bragged about for months, the one he told everyone he had planned himself, had never belonged to him at all. Every dream he was about to lose belonged to the woman he had just told to go home. Grace had spent almost a year putting this trip together, though nobody in that terminal knew it yet, least of all the man standing frozen at the checkpoint with a red light blinking above his boarding pass. It started quietly, the way most of Grace's plans did. She was a corporate travel executive, the kind of professional who spent her days solving impossible logistics for people who never bothered learning her last name. She had built relationships over 15 years with hotel directors, airline liaisons, sports hospitality coordinators, and event organizers who trusted her judgment completely. When the World Cup final schedule was announced, Grace made a single phone call to an old client named Olivia Brooks, a luxury event coordinator she had worked with for years. Within a month, Grace had secured tickets that most people only dreamed about: business-class flights, a penthouse suite in downtown Dallas, VIP hospitality access, and a private airport transfer service. None of it came from money. All of it came from years of showing up, doing excellent work, and building trust that couldn't be bought. Every phone call Grace made that year happened quietly, usually late at night after Mark had already gone to sleep, or during her lunch breaks when he assumed she was catching up on emails. She spoke to hotel directors who remembered her from 3 years earlier when she'd solved an impossible booking crisis during a hurricane evacuation. She spoke to hospitality coordinators who owed her favors for handling last-minute cancellations without ever losing her composure. She negotiated with airline liaisons who trusted her word over contracts because she had never once broken a promise to them. None of it was luck. None of it was money. It was 15 years of quiet competence finally being called in, all at once, for the person she loved most. She didn't tell Mark how she'd gotten any of it. She let him believe what he wanted to believe, mostly because he never actually asked. Mark simply announced to his friends, his coworkers, and even his mother that he had finally planned something unforgettable for their anniversary. He posted vague captions online about surprising my wife with the trip of a lifetime. He told his mother on the phone, loud enough for Grace to hear from the next room. You know me, Ma. I always go big when it matters. Grace listened to him take credit in conversation after conversation and said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that correcting him publicly only made him defensive, and privately, it never seemed to matter enough to fight about. There were nights she almost said something. Once, lying beside him in bed, she opened her mouth to remind him gently that she was the one who had spent months arranging everything, that Olivia had personally vouched for her to secure the hospitality passes, that none of it had come easily. But Mark was already asleep, snoring softly, his phone still glowing on the nightstand with a half-finished text bragging to a coworker about his connections. Grace closed her mouth, turned off the lamp, and told herself it didn't matter. She would rather let him have the spotlight than fight over credit that cost her nothing to give away. She didn't yet know how expensive that generosity was about to become. There were moments in the weeks leading up to the trip that made Grace laugh quietly to herself, even as they frustrated her. Mark told a room full of coworkers that he had connections inside FIFA, though he mispronounced nearly every official's name he tried to reference, calling one federation president Mr. FFA, as though the organization itself were a person. His coworkers laughed along, unsure whether he was joking, and Mark, mistaking their confusion for admiration, kept going. At the airport lounge on the morning they left, he stood in front of a television, correcting the sports commentator's analysis of the match, arguing loudly with a screen that obviously couldn't hear him. "That's not how extra time works," he announced to no one in particular. "I've watched this sport my whole life." Grace, sipping her coffee nearby, had never once seen him watch a full match without checking his phone every 10 minutes. He explained offside rules to a stranger sitting nearby, getting the explanation completely wrong, describing it as basically like being caught stealing second base. The stranger nodded politely, clearly not interested in correcting him, and simply returned to his newspaper. When a bartender gently corrected him on a completely unrelated fact about the tournament's host cities, Mark argued anyway, insisting he was right, growing louder instead of quieter. "I'm telling you," Mark said, tapping the bar for emphasis. "It's in Dallas and Houston both. I read the whole schedule." "Sir," respectfully, "the finals only in one city," the bartender said patiently. "Well, maybe they changed it," Mark said, waving him off, unwilling to simply say he might be wrong. Grace sat a few feet away, catching the bartender's eye, mouthing a silent apology. The bartender smiled back, clearly used to overconfident travelers who didn't know when to stop talking. It was a small moment, barely worth mentioning on its own, but it was one of dozens that week, each one a quiet reminder of exactly who Mark became when he thought people were watching. Grace didn't mind the embarrassment as much as people might expect. She had grown used to being the quiet one in the marriage, the one who absorbed Mark's bigger personality without competing for space. She believed dignity spoke louder than shouting ever could. She believed patience was a form of strength, not weakness. But patience, she was about to learn, had a limit, and Mark was about to find it. Everything changed the moment they landed in Dallas and ran into Derek Collins, Mark's wealthy college friend, along with two of Derek's friends from out of state. The transformation in Mark was almost instant. His shoulders straightened. His voice deepened. He greeted Derek with a loud handshake and a laugh that seemed designed entirely for an audience. "Look at this setup," Derek said, glancing around the VIP check-in area. "You really outdid yourself, man." Mark grinned. "I told you I had it handled." Grace stood a few steps behind him, saying nothing, watching him absorb credit for months of her work without a flicker of hesitation. "This is Grace," Mark said finally, almost as an afterthought. "My wife tagged along." Tagged along. Grace felt the words land somewhere quiet inside her chest, but she kept her expression pleasant. She had heard worse phrasing from him before. She told herself it wasn't worth ruining the morning over. Derek's friend complimented the VIP hospitality package, the private lounge access, the premium seating. "Man, how do you even score all this? These passes are basically impossible to get." Mark puffed his chest slightly. "I know important people," he said, glancing at Grace as though daring her to correct him. She didn't. She smiled politely, the same practice smile she used in client meetings when someone said something wildly inaccurate that wasn't worth correcting in front of an audience. But Mark, encouraged by the attention, grew bolder with every passing minute. He began speaking louder, laughing harder, performing for his friends in a way that made Grace feel smaller with every sentence. He described the penthouse suite as though he'd handpicked the furniture himself. He described the hospitality lounge as though he personally knew the sponsors hosting it. Derek's friends nodded along, impressed, occasionally glancing at Grace with a kind of polite disinterest, as though she were simply part of the luggage. At one point, Grace gently mentioned a detail about the transfer schedule, something practical, something that would help the group avoid missing their shuttle. Mark cut her off mid-sentence. "I've got it, babe. Let the men handle logistics." Derek's friends laughed. Grace felt her jaw tighten, but she said nothing, filing the comment away with dozens of others like it she had learned to absorb over the years. When they reached the final security checkpoint before their gate, one of Derek's friends made a joke about wives slowing down travel plans, something about needing 3 extra bags and 20 extra minutes. Mark laughed loudly, glancing sideways at Grace with a look she recognized instantly, the look he wore right before he said something he thought was funny but wasn't. "Speaking of," he said, grinning at his friends, "why don't you head out, babe? Let the guys handle the rest from here." Grace blinked. "Mark, I'm serious," he said, his voice rising, performing now, fully aware of the audience surrounding him. "My friends are here. Don't make this awkward." "Guess somebody's traveling solo," one of Derek's friends said, smirking. The group laughed. Mark laughed harder, feeding off them, off the attention, off the version of himself he only became in front of other men. "Go home," he said, loud enough for the people around them to hear. The terminal seemed to grow quiet around that single sentence. Grace didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply smiled, a small, calm smile that unsettled the people watching far more than tears ever could have. "Are you absolutely sure?" she asked one more time, giving him a final chance he didn't know he needed. "Yes," Mark said, already turning back toward his friends. "Go. I've got this handled." That smile was the last thing Mark saw before everything he'd bragged about for months began quietly disappearing. Grace walked away from the group without another word. She found a quiet corner cafe near the gate, ordered a coffee she had no intention of finishing, and opened her laptop. Her hands were steady. Her expression was calm. She wasn't acting out of anger. She was acting out of ownership, reclaiming what had always been hers to control in the first place. One by one, she began canceling reservations she had spent a year arranging. The luxury hotel suite in downtown Dallas vanished from the system first. Then the VIP hospitality bracelets deactivated remotely. The private airport chauffeur received a cancellation notice and left the pickup zone without waiting. The exclusive restaurant reservations disappeared from the booking system. The luxury rental car canceled. Even the champagne welcome package Grace had arranged for their suite vanished from the online order. Mark, still standing near the gate with his friends, assumed the flight delay screens were malfunctioning. He tried explaining to Derek that airport computers were always buggy this time of year, a statement that made absolutely no sense but sounded confident enough that his friends nodded along. "Seriously, man," Derek said, frowning at his own phone. "My hotel booking just vanished too. It says it's linked to your reservation." "That's impossible," Mark said. "I booked everything myself." Meanwhile, chaos multiplied around the group in ways that were almost comedic. Derek's friend discovered his luggage transfer had been rerouted incorrectly, sending his bags toward a hotel that no longer existed in the system. Another friend accidentally booked the wrong connecting flight after panicking and trying to rearrange things himself, ending up with a layover in a city none of them had ever planned to visit. A third ended up reserving a motel room next to a highway truck stop after the luxury hotel system showed no available rooms under Mark's name. The confirmation email arriving with a photo of a flickering neon sign and a shared parking lot with an 18-wheeler idling outside. Someone else paid triple the normal rate trying to secure a last-minute room nearby, muttering under his breath the entire time about how this was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. "Man, what is going on?" Derek asked, running a hand through his hair, his earlier admiration for Mark curdling into visible irritation. "You said you had connections." "I do," Mark insisted, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "This has to be some kind of system error. I'll call someone." He dialed the hotel directly, put the phone on speaker so his friends could hear, expecting a simple resolution. "I'm sorry, sir," the voice on the line said. "I don't see an active reservation under that name. The booking was canceled this morning by the primary account holder." "That's me," Mark said. "I'm the primary account holder." There was a pause, the sound of keys clicking on the other end. "Sir, The account is registered to a Grace Johnson. Mark's friends went quiet. Derek raised an eyebrow, glancing between Mark and the phone, waiting for an explanation that didn't come. Airport staff remained polite through it all, but there was nothing they could do. The reservations had never belonged to Mark. They belonged to a name none of his friends recognized at first, printed clearly across every canceled booking confirmation. Grace Johnson. Mark stared at the screen on his phone, reading the name over and over, his stomach twisting into a knot he didn't yet have words for. If you're still watching up to now, type, "I'm still here," in the comment section. Mark spent the next 20 minutes trying to fix what he assumed was a simple mistake. He called the hotel directly, insisting there had been an error. The front desk manager calmly informed him that all reservations under his corporate travel account required authorization from the primary account holder, someone named Grace Johnson. Mark blinked at the phone, his confidence cracking slightly for the first time that day. "Can you just put me on as the account holder?" he asked, his voice tight. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't have authorization to make that change without Mrs. Johnson's approval." He tried booking a new room using his personal credit card. It declined. He tried again. Declined a second time. A third attempt returned the same result, the little red error message blinking on his screen like a taunt. He didn't know that the emergency travel fund attached to that account had been quietly managed by Grace for the past 3 years, ever since Mark's spending habits had caused 2 overdraft incidents neither of them liked discussing. Incidents Grace had quietly absorbed and fixed without ever bringing them up again. He turned to his friends, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "Thanks, right? Always some kind of glitch." Nobody laughed with him this time. Derek's expression had shifted from amusement into something closer to disbelief. "Dude, we've been standing here for almost an hour. My flight home is in 3 hours, and I still don't have a place to sleep tonight." "I'm working on it," Mark snapped, more defensive than he meant to sound. "Working on what, exactly?" one of Derek's other friends muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Seems like your wife was working on everything, and you just told her to leave." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time that day, he had no clever comeback, no confident explanation, nothing to perform. Derek's expression had shifted from amusement to concern. "Mark," he said carefully, "maybe you should call Grace." "She'll fix it," Mark said, waving his hand the same way he'd waved Grace away at the checkpoint. "She always fixes things." He wasn't wrong. Grace had spent years quietly fixing things, smoothing over Mark's mistakes before they became public embarrassments, absorbing tension so their marriage looked effortless from the outside. But something about the way he said it, so casually, so certain that her competence existed purely for his convenience, made the sentence land differently in that moment than it ever had before. While Mark scrambled through failed phone calls and declined payments, a video began circulating among nearby travelers. Someone had filmed him earlier that morning at the lounge television, confidently correcting a sports analyst, and in the middle of his correction, accidentally referring to the World Cup final as basically the Super Bowl of soccer. The clip had been uploaded with the caption, "Airport Football Expert," and was already collecting comments from strangers laughing at his confident mistake. By the time Mark noticed people glancing at him and whispering, the clip had already made its way around several travelers waiting near the gate. A young man walked past, grinning. "Hey," he said, "aren't you that football expert?" Mark, still unaware of what was circulating, straightened up instinctively at the attention. "Yeah, that's me," he said, flashing a proud smile. The group of strangers burst into laughter. The nickname followed him for the rest of the day. "Airport analyst." Someone said it near the security line. Another person said it near the coffee kiosk. A teenager walked past wearing a jersey and called out, "Hey, airport analyst, what's the score going to be?" laughing with his friends as they hurried off toward their gate. Even one of Derek's friends muttered it under his breath, no longer trying to hide his embarrassment at being associated with the chaos unfolding around them. Mark tried to laugh it off at first, waving a hand dismissively the way he always did when he wanted to seem unbothered. But by the 4th or 5th time a stranger repeated it, his jaw tightened, his easy smile faltering just slightly at the corners. He pulled out his phone, searching his own name, and found the clip had already crossed 50,000 views, the comment section filled with jokes about extra time, penalty kicks, and someone confidently correcting a sport he claimed to know everything about. "It's not that big a deal," he muttered to Derek. though his tone suggested otherwise. Derek didn't answer right away. He was still staring at his phone, still trying to rebook a flight that had somehow been rerouted through 3 connecting cities. Man, right now, I've got bigger problems than your nickname. The comment stung more than Derek probably intended. Mark had spent the entire morning positioning himself as the man with the plan, the man with connections, the man who had it all figured out. Now he was the punchline, trending quietly across a terminal full of strangers, while his own friends could barely be bothered to look up from their own unraveling itineraries long enough to acknowledge it. Meanwhile, Grace's phone buzzed with a very different kind of message. Olivia Brooks, the event coordinator who had helped arrange the VIP hospitality package, had heard through her network that something had gone wrong with Grace's reservations. She called immediately, expecting to help smooth over a logistical error. "Grace, what happened? I'm seeing cancellations across the entire hospitality block under your name. Did something go wrong on our end?" Grace explained calmly, without drama, without exaggeration. She simply told Olivia what had happened at the checkpoint, word for word. Exactly the way it occurred, the way Mark had waved her off in front of his friends, the way he had said the words she still couldn't quite believe had come out of his mouth. There was a long pause on the line. "He told you to go home," Olivia repeated slowly. "In front of his friends. After you built this entire trip for him? Grace, do you understand what you accomplished to make this weekend happen? I called in favors I haven't used in 5 years." "I know," Grace said quietly. "I was there for all of it." "And he told you to go home?" "Yes," Grace said simply. Olivia exhaled sharply. "Well, that man just made the worst decision of his life, and I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as a fact. Grace, our VIP hospitality manager for the executive lounge, had a family emergency this morning. We're short-staffed, sponsors are already asking questions, and I need someone experienced, someone who understands logistics, sponsor coordination, and pressure without losing composure in front of important people. I already know exactly who that person is." Grace hesitated. "Olivia, I appreciate it, but I'm not exactly dressed for." "Grace," Olivia interrupted gently. "You've spent your entire career making other people's chaos look effortless. Let someone finally see you do it in the open. Come to the executive entrance. I'll have credentials waiting." For the first time all day, something in Grace's chest loosened. Within the hour, Grace was no longer simply attending the World Cup final as an anonymous guest riding on someone else's stolen credit. She was walking into elite hospitality lounges as the person responsible for coordinating them, a credential clipped to her blazer, a headset resting against her ear, her voice calm and precise as she directed staff through last-minute changes. She met retired football legends who greeted her by name after Olivia introduced her, men whose faces she had only ever seen on television, shaking her hand and thanking her for keeping the afternoon running smoothly. She coordinated logistics for international sponsors who complimented her calm, precise communication style. One executive telling Olivia quietly that Grace had solved in 10 minutes what our own team couldn't solve in 2 hours. She spoke briefly with a well-known broadcaster who thanked her personally for solving a scheduling conflict within minutes, the kind of problem that would have derailed the entire pre-match segment if left unresolved. At one point, a sponsor representative asked her how long she'd been doing this kind of work. 15 years, Grace said simply. "It shows," the woman replied. "I don't think I've seen anyone handle pressure like that all day." Grace smiled, the compliment settling somewhere warm inside her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in longer than she cared to admit. Nobody in this lounge called her tagging along. Nobody here dismissed her the way Mark had dismissed her hours earlier. Here, she was simply Grace Johnson, the woman who fixed things, the woman whose name appeared on reservations that actually mattered. Grace wasn't simply attending the World Cup anymore. She was helping run part of it. And outside, beyond the golden light of the hospitality entrance, Mark stood at a barricade with his friends, unable to get anywhere near the building that held everything he had bragged about for months. Desperation pushed Mark toward decisions he wouldn't have made under normal circumstances. Standing outside the stadium with his friends slowly drifting away from him, embarrassment radiating off each of them like heat, Mark pulled out his phone and searched frantically for resale tickets. He found a listing that seemed almost too perfect, seats close to the VIP section, priced at nearly triple face value. He didn't hesitate. He paid immediately, desperate to salvage some version of the day he had promised everyone. When he arrived at the gate holding his printed resale ticket, the scanner beeped an unfamiliar sound. The security officer frowned, checked the ticket again, then looked up at Mark with an expression that had already made its judgment. "Sir, this ticket is fraudulent. It's already been scanned and used earlier today." Mark's stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I just bought it. I paid nearly $3,000 for this." "I understand, sir, but I'll need you to step aside. Can you check again? Maybe the system made a mistake. Please, just check one more time." "Sir, I've checked twice. This credential has already been used." Two additional security officers appeared beside the first, their presence calm but firm. Mark's voice rose, panicked, pleading, completely unlike the confident tone he'd used all morning. "You don't understand. My wife planned this. This trip belongs to us. I need to get inside. I flew here from Houston. I have people waiting for me." The officers remained unmoved. "Sir, step aside, please. Can I at least speak to a supervisor? There has to be someone I can talk to about this." "Sir, you're causing a disturbance. Step aside now, or we'll escort you off the premises entirely." Mark's shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of his voice, replaced by something smaller, quieter, almost childlike in its desperation. "Please," he said one more time, barely above a whisper. "I just want to watch the match." The officer's expression softened slightly, but the answer didn't change. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't let you through." Nearby travelers slowed to watch, some recognizing him from the earlier viral clip, whispering the nickname that had followed him across the terminal. Mark felt the heat rise in his face, the humiliation compounding with every passing second. Derek stepped forward, attempting to help, but even he seemed to have run out of excuses to offer. "Officer, is there anything we can do? He's had a rough day." "Sir, I'd advise you step back as well," the officer replied evenly. Derek raised his hands and retreated a step, glancing at Mark with something that looked almost like pity. When Mark turned to him, expecting backup, expecting the loyalty of the friend he'd known since college, expecting Derek to fight for him the way he'd always assumed friendship worked, Derek simply shook his head. "Man, I've known you 20 years, Derek said, his voice quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "And I've never seen you talk to Grace the way you talked to her this morning." I laughed along back there because that's what you do when your friend's showing off. But watching all this fall apart around you, I keep thinking about the way she just walked away without raising her voice. That's not a woman who panics, Mark. That's a woman who's done. "Derek, come on." "Mark," he said quietly, cutting him off. "You should have respected your wife." The words landed harder than anything Mark had heard all day. He was escorted away from the entrance, his resale ticket confiscated as evidence of fraud, his friends scattering in different directions, each of them suddenly remembering somewhere else they needed to be. Mark stood alone outside the stadium as thousands of fans streamed past him, laughing, celebrating, wearing jerseys and face paint, moving toward an experience he had told an entire terminal belonged to him. Inside, in a hospitality suite filled with soft lighting, familiar faces, and the quiet hum of respectful conversation, Grace watched the opening minutes of the match from a seat she had earned through nothing but her own competence. The contrast between the two of them in that single moment was almost impossible to comprehend. One person standing outside, stripped of the confidence that had defined the entire trip. One person sitting inside, finally recognized for exactly who she had always been. Grace never intended any of this as revenge. She wasn't chasing the satisfaction of watching Mark suffer outside a stadium he'd been denied entry to. She had simply refused, for the first time in years, to keep quietly rewarding disrespect with more effort, more patience, more silence. By the time the match ended and celebration erupted across the stadium, Grace made her way outside through a quieter exit reserved for staff and hospitality coordinators. She wasn't looking for Mark. She wasn't planning some dramatic confrontation. She simply needed fresh air after hours of coordinating logistics under pressure. She found him sitting on a low concrete barrier near the edge of the parking structure, alone, his phone dark in his lap, his jersey slightly wrinkled, his posture completely different from the confident man who had told her to go home earlier that day. There was no arrogance left in him, no performance, no audience to impress, only regret. Grace stood a few feet away, watching him for a moment before speaking. You look tired, she said finally. Mark looked up slowly, his eyes red, his voice quieter than she'd heard it in years. I ruined everything, he said. I spent years trying to impress strangers, trying to make people think I had it all figured out, while ignoring the one person who actually made my life extraordinary. Grace sat down beside him, keeping a small distance between them, not quite ready to close it completely. Do you know how long I've been arranging this trip, Mark? A while, I'm guessing, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Longer than I gave you credit for. Almost a year, she said. Every phone call, every favor, every late night after you were already asleep. And you stood at that checkpoint and told me to go home in front of your friends like I was an inconvenience you were finally getting rid of. Mark flinched. I know. I don't even know why I said it. I think I just wanted them to think I was. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Important, Grace offered quietly. Yeah, he admitted, the word barely audible. Important. And instead, I ended up the punchline of the entire airport. Grace didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch between them, the kind of silence that says more than any argument ever could. I kept thinking, if I could just get inside, if I could just fix it, everything would go back to normal, Mark continued. But even standing at that gate, begging a stranger to let me through, all I could think about was how quiet it felt without you next to me. That's when I understood. It was never about the seats. Finally, Grace asked the only question that mattered. If security had let you inside, would you even be sorry right now? Mark opened his mouth, then closed it again. He searched for an answer, some version of himself that could honestly claim the humiliation alone had taught him the lesson, rather than the loss. He couldn't find one. That silence, longer and heavier than anything spoken between them all day, became the loudest moment of the entire story. Several months later, in Houston, Grace and Mark stood together at a different sporting event, another trip carefully arranged, another set of premium seats secured through Grace's professional network. The months between the World Cup weekend and this one hadn't been easy. There had been long conversations late into the night, uncomfortable moments where Mark had to sit with the specific memory of the word, go home, and everything it had cost him. He had started asking Grace about her work, really asking, listening to the answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk. He had stopped introducing her as someone who simply came along for the ride. This time, when a stranger complimented their seating and asked how they'd managed to get such incredible access, Mark didn't hesitate the way he once would have. My wife planned everything, he said, his voice steady, genuine, free of performance. She's the reason we're here. Grace smiled, something warm settling behind her expression that hadn't been there in a long time. So, she said, glancing at him with a small, teasing smile, should I go home? Mark laughed, the sound different now, softer, more honest than the laugh he'd used to impress his friends months earlier. I'd rather miss the match, he said, than lose you again. Respect, it turns out, works a lot like a passport. Most people don't notice how valuable it is until the moment they lose the right to move forward. Grace never set out to teach Mark a lesson that weekend. She simply stopped absorbing disrespect quietly, stopped rewarding arrogance with patience, and allowed the natural consequences of his own choices to unfold exactly as they were always going to. Pride convinced Mark that recognition from strangers mattered more than the loyalty of the person who had built his entire life behind the scenes. It took losing everything publicly, humiliation compounding in front of people whose opinions never actually mattered, for him to understand that quiet competence had been holding up his world the entire time. Love without respect rarely survives success, because success has a way of revealing exactly who someone becomes when they think no one who truly knows them is watching closely enough to notice. Pride can cancel more than plane tickets and hotel reservations. It can cancel trust. It can cancel intimacy. It can cancel the quiet foundation an entire relationship was built on, one dismissive comment at a time. Quiet confidence, the kind Grace carried through every moment of that humiliating weekend, will always outlast loud arrogance, because dignity doesn't need an audience to remain true. Karma doesn't always announce itself with shouting or confrontation. Sometimes it simply waits patiently at a security checkpoint, scans a boarding pass that no longer exists, and lets a red light do all the talking. Grace often thinks back on that morning at the airport, not with anger anymore, but with a strange kind of gratitude. It took losing an entire weekend of plans, watching a marriage nearly buckle under the weight of unspoken resentment, for both of them to finally see each other clearly. She never wanted to embarrass Mark. She never wanted headlines or viral clips or strangers whispering nicknames behind his back. She only wanted, after years of quietly holding everything together, to be seen as more than an afterthought standing a few steps behind him. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. We poured real care into building Grace and Mark's journey, and we hope it made you laugh, made you reflect, and maybe even reminded you of someone you know. Comment below and tell us what you enjoyed most about this story, whether it was the airport chaos, Grace's calm confidence, or Mark's long overdue reckoning. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next cinematic tale of love, pride, justice, and unforgettable twists.